With the release of Breach and the music video for City Walls, 21 Pilots have finally brought a decade-long story to an end. The story is one which is set in the fantasy world of Trench and the city of Dema and filled with these various lore elements and characters and so on. You're probably quite familiar with what I'm talking about, but something that I've remarked upon time and again when discussing and doing deep dives into this lore in the world that Tyler Joseph and Josh Dunn created is that there are a number of ways in which it appears likely that Lord of the Rings, the trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, influenced the look and addition of a number of different elements of this story. Now, that's not to say in any way that 21 Pilots just ripped off Tolkien's work or were just copying what he had done before. But we do know, as they've stated in interviews in the past, that both Tyler Joseph and Josh Dunn are fans of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, both the books and the movies, and Tyler more specifically. So it would make sense the various aspects of that work might have inspired certain elements that Tyler chose to include when creating this world. And I think the idea of such influence is an interesting one, not just because it's cool to see connections between these two different stories, but also because if it is the case that Tyler was influenced by Lord of the Rings and all of that, and that certain imagery that he chose to employ in his own lore and story were connected to that or inspired by that, it would help to explain and understand some of these elements in the Dema story and the lore of the world of Trench. So with that being said, let us take a look at the 9 ways in which I think Lord of the Rings introduced the story of Dema and the world of Trench. Number 1, the drawings and maps. Now, I understand this is not something that's specific to the story of Dema or even specific to the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, but Tolkien certainly is someone who spent a lot of time developing and building out the world in which he set the stories of Lord of the Rings and the other stories that he wrote within this world of Middle-earth. And as part of that, he created a bunch of these maps. And these are featured quite prominently, not just in the print editions in the books of Lord of the Rings, but also in the movies themselves. And this is something that we see 21 Pilots implementing in the visual side of their music, in these story-based music videos, as they call them. Specifically, we see maps in videos like Overcompensate, and we also see them outlined in the I Am Clancy and the I Am Torchbearer videos. And then, of course, even before we got the story-based music videos, there was the whole Dema.org website that was uncovered, and that contained maps of Dema as well. So the maps and the drawings behind these stories have always played a key role in the Dema story, especially as we saw the maps updating as more and more information was kind of revealed about this world as we went through the story. Music videos like The Outside and songs like Paladin Strait revealed a bit more about the geography. We saw the island of Voltsoy and, of course, the Paladin Strait, the body of water in between that island and the main continent of Trench and the city of Dema. And then obviously places like the Port of Vile and so on, which tie into the idea and the concept of vialism and add to the realism and believability of this being an actual place that exists. Number 2, the color scheme and sort of the setting of the good guys versus the bad guys. In the story of Dema, we see the good guys, the banditos, depicted in greens, like an olive green, brown, yellow, things like that. And they also live more in nature. The bad guys are depicted in red and black and live more in a sort of brutalist, industrial-looking city. The bishops of Dema, the guards of Dema, and so on. Which can sort of be compared to characters like elves and hobbits, who in the mythology of Lord of the Rings are some of the most pure at heart and things like that, also are very much in touch with nature and living in the Shire or the woodland realm. And they're much more associated with those colors of kind of green and brown and even yellow to some regard. But the colors of sort of black and red and the industrial aspects to things like that much more ties into the bad guys in Lord of the Rings. Think of the land of Mordor and what that becomes under Sauron's rule and the towers that he builds. And then even in those visions that Sam has of what Hobbiton might become if Sauron wins the War of the Ring and the Shire turns into a sort of industrial factory town instead of the peaceful landscape and countryside town that it is. Number 3, we have the 9 bishops of Dema in comparison to the 9 Nazgul in Lord of the Rings. In both cases, there is one of the 9 who is the leader of the rest. We've got Blurryface and we've got the Witch King of Angmar, the leader of the Nazgul. The bishops also ride horses and track down the main character, just like they do in Lord of the Rings. They're also sort of hooded and cloaked. The main difference is that the bishops of Dema wear a bright red, or maybe not the brightest red, but a very colorful and clear red, as opposed to the dark, shadowy form of the Nazgul riding their horses. And then also the bishops tend to ride white horses, whereas the Nazgul were riding black horses when they were riding horses. That was really only something that we see in the first book. But still, an interesting comparison nonetheless, especially with the similarity in the number 9. Number 4, and this sort of ties into what we were just talking about, the idea that Clancy is an exception, someone who's special and holds some sort of special ability and is constantly being tracked down by the bishops, just like Frodo, holding the special ability or the power of the ring, is constantly tracked down by the 9 Nazgul on their horses. So similar to the third point, but different in its own way as well. But because of that similarity, there's not much more to say on it than that. Number 5, and this is interesting, a corrupting power. This one's a bit more nuanced, but something which I talked about right around the end of the Clancy tour, when we started getting these letters and the sentiment from Clancy himself, saying that he no longer wanted to overthrow and destroy and burn down Dema, but instead wanted to become a bishop of Dema in his own right and rule the city. That's obviously what we saw take place at the end of City Walls, and whether or not that took place in exactly the plan that he had in mind when he wrote that letter or in another way still remains to be kind of discussed and unpacked and theorized about. But the fact remains that there is a sense in which his plans changed, and his desire to overthrow Dema was replaced by a desire to rule. So we have this corrupting power, this corrupting idea of wanting power, of wanting control, that we see playing out as a key aspect of the story ever since the first album in the story, if you look at Blurryface being the first album of this 5-album saga. And then more specifically, as a more tangible thing, I've often pointed to the antlers and the power of psychokinesis that they harness as a more specific representation of this corrupting power, of this corrupting idea of wanting control. And that can be tied into the main central object of the story of Lord of the Rings, the One Ring of Power, this corrupting force, which when you possess it, even if you don't use it a lot, even if you're more pure of heart, still comes to corrupt you and wield its own power over you, so that you yourself want power, control, and dominion, even against your best efforts or best wishes. Number 6, we have this idea of the hero and his faithful companion. Again, this is a more subtle one, but we do see parallels between Clancy and the Torchbearer and Frodo and Sam. Sam is always unwavering, always there to provide his support and help Frodo when needed, and in similar fashion, Clancy, even when he turns against his friends, even when he betrays them, the Torchbearer still has this desire to help Clancy, help him break free of the cycle, constantly returning time and again to help the latest iteration of Clancy try to break free of the cycle, despite being constantly betrayed by him time after time. Number 7, and this one again is a bit more specific, we have the imagery of the single eye. Obviously, as 21 Pilots went on their first hiatus, and then also as a piece of imagery that we saw earlier this year, as they began teasing Breach, the idea of this eye, this single eye, not a pair of eyes, being a key piece of imagery. And then we also obviously see that the lidless eye in Lord of the Rings as a representation of Sauron and the ever-watchful presence of the enemy. Just like the bishops and their towers watch over the city of Dema and watch over and guard their inhabitants, they are watching, so too does the eye ever burning in Mordor watch over its lands and seek and hunt for the ring. Number 8 is a bit more of a subtle detail, but something which instantly came to mind the second I saw this in the music video for Paladin Strait. Towards the end, as Clancy climbs the tower and the bishops and the Torchbearer are fighting against the undead Glorious Gone, the sun begins to rise and spill out over the valley as it breaks over the crest of the mountains on the horizon. And that image has always very much reminded me of that scene in the Battle of Helm's Deep towards the end, when the sunlight breaks over the crest and represents the return of hope to the sort of dark lands and the dark long night through which they had fought and tried to defend their home against this army of orcs. Again, I'm not sure if there's much more to the connection than simply similar imagery, but I always thought there was a sort of reminiscent parallel between those two scenes and those two moments of their respective stories. And then finally, number 9, we have the Torchbearer climbing the tower to find Clancy as he makes his last stand against his inner self and this corrupting power, in a sense, if you look at Blurryface in that light. In a similar way, Sam climbed Mount Doom, hunting for and trying to find Frodo as he made his last stand against the One Ring of Power, and both of them lose. Right? Clancy and Frodo both succumb to this corrupting power and turn evil in a sense, right? Frodo succumbs to the power of the ring, and Clancy succumbs to the power of Blurryface, despite defeating both of them in a sense. Which sort of ties into this broader idea of the ending of both stories, which is that the hero falls prey and fails his quest at the end, succumbing to the corrupting power, succumbing to the thing against which they have been fighting and trying to destroy, which is another sort of interesting theme and an interesting parallel, this idea of trying to destroy the enemy or the corrupting power or the thing that you are fighting against. And the difference between them is that in the story of Dema and at the end of the Trench saga, there was no Gollum to come in and break the spell and try to seize it for himself. There is no Gollum character in this story because it's a different story, obviously, so it makes sense that there wasn't, but the parallel kind of ends there, right? Frodo loses, in a sense, right? He fails his quest, and then it is actually, the day is saved by Gollum appearing. There is no creature like that. There's no character like that in the Dema story. So Clancy just fails in his quest and has to start over. And the Torchbearer has to go and find the next Clancy to help him try once again. So those are all the main key ways in which I see there being parallels between the story of Dema and the story of Lord of the Rings, and the ways in which I think Tyler may have been influenced or inspired by the works of Tolkien and the film adaptations by Peter Jackson. If you think there are other elements or other parallels that I missed in this list, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to explore other ideas or other elements of this in future videos or in the comment section with all of you. And as always, don't forget to subscribe for more music commentary and reviews.